Today, we have Dr. Myron Abbasas, who is an assistant professor and coordinator of the undergraduate program in deaf education at Flagler College in beautiful St. Augustine, Florida. Dr. Myron Abbasas has over 10 years of K-12 teaching experience in deaf education in the bilingual setting and over 17 years of experience dedicated to the field as a professional. She has previously served as the constituent chair for deaf and hard of hearing for the Division of Communicative Disabilities and Deafness through the Council for Exceptional Children, and as a board member for Hands and Voices Michigan. Dr. Myron Abbas's research is focused on the content area reading practices of teachers in upper grade classrooms in signing programs, and has dedicated her study and service to building bridges in deaf education. We appreciate her being here to present the Radical Middle, Trends for Change, Broadening Our Community of Practice. For more information on the Radical Middle, check out their website at radicalmiddledhh.org. And now, ladies.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. It's really a pleasure to be here to share some of the work that myself and some of my wonderful colleagues are doing with regards to changing the narrative in our field. So it's really wonderful to be here. So what I want to start off with kind of talking today, and I do want to point out that I would love for this to be a dialogue. So if you do have a question throughout, please don't be afraid to ask, because I think sometimes these things are better discussed as a conversation than just me speaking to you directly. But the first step in kind of understanding this whole idea behind radically middle practice in the field of deaf education is first taking a step towards examining what your personal beliefs are as a professional. We all come to the field with a lens based on our experiences, based on the folks that have taught us throughout the years, based on the language choices we've made. And so everyone comes with a different perspective and a different lens. And so the first step is to really look at what do I believe as a professional before we can reach out and understand how others are viewing the field as well. So I have an image here that I'd like everyone to just take a look at for a moment. And in your mind, I want you to determine the correct number of planks of wood that you see in this image. So keep that in your mind just for a second. And this is what I want you to be thinking about when you're examining your own beliefs as a professional. Now I'm going to put out the image here to give you the correct answer. So by looking at this image, you can see that based on perspective, you come up with a very, very different answer. And I think that's one of the things that we really need to keep in the back of our minds when we address educational strategies, educational placements, language decisions, working with parents, working with teachers, working with families as professionals. We may see very clearly 4 planks of wood in front of us. However, the person that we're interacting with may really only see 3 based on their experience. So really, we're kind of both right in a way. Now, when we think about the historical context of our field, we know that for quite some time, there's been a lot of division and debate over what is the best way to educate children who are deaf or hard of hearing. And I think one thing to really wrap your mind around is this: you can't force people to understand a message that they're not ready to receive. And part of that is really understanding and getting to understand and the perspectives of others, and understanding why they have those perspectives. Still, however, planting a seed or starting a conversation to help others understand where you're coming from is a lot more powerful than people really believe or people think at times. When we think about the education of children who are deaf or hard of hearing, I have about 5 or 6 different books sitting in front of me at the moment, all with the same theme. We know that our children are not all the same, and we know that there is not one best way to educate, to communicate, to do anything with all of our children. We are very heterogeneous, and so we need to be open to different perspectives, different points of view, and different approaches. So keeping that in mind, I'd like to do a little bit of an interactive component if possible, and we can utilize the chat box or however your mics if you like in terms of raising your hand. But I'd like to pose some questions to the audience today. So reflecting on your practice and thinking about just some of the components that I've spoken about right now, how have your views on language and education affected you or shaped you as a professional, the way you interact with parents or your colleagues even at work, or shaped the decision-making practices for your deaf and hard of hearing students? Thanks, Sherry. So if you'd like to respond to one or any of those questions, you can certainly enter them in the chat box. And I'll give folks just a moment. Catherine mentions that she finds that what she taught 10 years ago is very different than her views now. Catherine, I would love to know a little bit more about how your views have evolved over the last 10 years. Absolutely. I think I can relate to Catherine, and later on in the presentation, I'll share a little bit about how I came to this point uh, as a professional in the field. But I will definitely say that if you met me 17 years ago, you would have found a very different person speaking to you about what my beliefs were with regards to education and language for deaf and hard of hearing children. But yes, it is exciting to grow. And I'm looking at a comment from Harold Johnson about the focus upon pragmatics and social construction and use of language. And I think we have one more. So just looking through what I'm reading now is definitely over time, we have all kind of shaped and grown through our own professional development. I see here cochlear implants and texting. Yes, so our technology has changed a great deal as well. So what we understood about cochlear implants, let's say in the 80s and early 90s, that technology has evolved so much that you can't help but change the way that you view some of these technologies that we use in the deaf and hard of hearing classroom as well. So everything, information is evolving, research is evolving. Our connections to the deaf community in the last 10 years through social media, through the internet, um, we are able to connect a lot more. And I think that's been a really driving force in how we view these different perspectives and how we can reach out and build bridges between these different groups. When we look into the research, and I know these are a little bit, a couple years old, but still very poignant, we see that, however, despite how that folks are kind of changing with the times and using professional development opportunities to shift their perspectives and how they approach working with parents and their colleagues and their students, we still see this thread of, especially with teachers, I'm sorry, especially with parents, that their interactions with professionals still are kind of clouded in this air of bias. Now, as human beings, of course, we're going to be biased. That's part of human nature. But taking a step forward in having more authentic connections with our parents and providing them with the information that they need, sometimes we just need to put that in the forefront of our mind and say, okay, I know that I'm coming from this perspective. let me talk about my strengths in that perspective, but let me also make sure that I am giving parents and my colleagues all of the information that is available, all of the information that they need. And I think that's where we need a lot of work in terms of professionals. There are certainly many professionals that are doing an excellent job of that, but I think when we look down towards what teachers are doing and parents are doing, they're still sort of feeling those undertones of someone is not giving me the full picture of everything that I could be doing with my child. And so we know that the research has looked into that. I'm putting up this next quote, and this was something that was a quote from a parent that I was having a conversation with actually quite recently, and it really struck a chord with me when she had said, "I have been attacked and ridiculed for my choices with my son, and I am now on the defense with people I don't know." And so that's kind of the other side of the coin, is that when we are very adamant in our stance with an approach, which yes, you're the expert in whatever approach that you're in, and you should be very, confident in that. But when you're adamant to the point where the person that you're communicating with feels like you are devaluing the choices that they've made as a parent or as a person, or what they might be doing is successful for them, but you don't view it that way, it can be quite damaging. And that type of language, my apologies that my office phone is ringing, that type of language can really have a negative impact on building bridges between parents, professionals, and the academic community. So when we look to how we can grow as professionals and what we need to be doing to grow, you'll see at the top it says the cycle of professional development and growth. And in the web links part of the screen that you're looking at, you'll see slide 9, cycle of professional development. That will link you to the original document that this is from, that I'm basing this off of. But basically, what I want to point out here is that when we step outside of ourselves to examine our own personal beliefs, like we have in the beginning of this process, we begin this cycle or cyclical process of professional development. And this is kind of how you can break down the steps towards finding the middle. So first, we have to build a knowledge base, and we have a lot of knowledge base in the research, in publications, and throughout presentations that we see in the area of deaf education. So now that we have all of this wonderful knowledge, it's time to start building a knowledge base where we're bridging manual communication and listening and spoken language, or those types of philosophies or placements or ideals. And so we need to start working on building a bridge between our knowledge base instead of just having knowledge out there. The next stage, of course, is to observe models and examples. We often see that when we go to conferences, my apologies, I'm going to take that one right off the hook. Apparently someone wants to get in touch with me. When we observe models and examples, sometimes when we go to our respective conferences and professional development opportunities and whatever we're going to for our own professional development, the models and examples that we see sometimes are kind of siloed within certain philosophical approaches. And so when we're looking to broaden our knowledge base and make bridges across philosophical models, we need to observe models and examples from both sides. One of the things that I often tell my colleagues and friends is that I would really wish that we would have more conferences where we are working together instead of having our separate conferences. So I have a colleague of mine, for example, going to the Alexander Graham Bell conference. And I said, well, that's great. I should be going to that conference. And National Association for the Deaf, well, she should be coming to that conference. And so we need to have more of those models and examples where we're sharing information across a wide spectrum of information. When we look at radical middle practice too, it really kind of focuses on those last three. So reflecting on the practice that we have and how we can make ourselves better through changing our practice. So as a professional, I've made a commitment to say that when a parent or a teacher comes to me seeking advice for a particular student, the first thing I say to them is, I am an expert in this area, and this is what I know a lot about. However, what I know a lot about doesn't mean that that's the only bit of information that's available. And if I can't answer a question, or if I don't know how to guide a parent or a teacher into another direction, I have made a commitment to making connections with professionals that have different views and different areas of expertise that I can easily direct parents to. And so that's part of the process of changing practice. And then finally, that gaining and sharing of expertise. So that making a commitment to say, I am going to make a professional relationship with someone that I might not normally have had, so that I can expand my expertise, my knowledge base, and so that I can be more of a resource for the people that I am serving in my field. So this has been kind of an interesting journey for me. Oh, I see that I have a raised hand. Catherine, did you have something that you'd like to add? Is choice for some? Okay, so Catherine's asking, is the choice for some to go to one conference and someone else to go to another's because we have pigeonholed into a specific model? I think that's a really great question, Catherine. And I think what it kind of boils down to, and this is not just a deaf education thing, I think this is just a general thing, is when we start getting further and further in our careers, or when we start getting further and further into our study in certain areas, we tend to, the term people use is we kind of live in silos. So if you can imagine like a silo on a farm, we have all of this wonderful information and it's all kind of related and it all kind of makes sense. Sometimes people will say echo chamber. Right. And so we kind of gravitate towards, well, this is what interests me. This is what I want to know more about. And we start creating kind of artificial divisions because of what we want to learn or what we're interested in learning. And so sometimes it's uncomfortable to say, well, I'm not really interested in, for example, for me, it would be, maybe auditory verbal therapy, for example, because my area of expertise is in bilingual education and using American Sign Language. So I would really have to make a conscious decision to say, I would like to learn more about this approach. So instead of going to something that would immediately be a natural interest for me, I would really have to make an effort to do that. And I think that just kind of naturally occurs as we kind of funnel down information from very wide, broad topics to very specific topics. And so, again, that's just something that really happens in every field. But yes, and Catherine continues, I feel that it limits us, but yes, comfort is a natural tendency. Yeah, and I think that's just what we do as humans, but also as professionals. I want to perfect my craft, so obviously I'm going to be going to things that are going to help me get better in the area that I'm in. So doing this is a little bit uncomfortable and sometimes unnatural. When I think about my journey as a professional, you're welcome, Catherine. When I think about my journey as a professional, and I'm a very sharey person. I like to share my own stories because I think it's important to make that human connection. And look at each other as humans instead of just only professionals. But when I started in the field, I was a very strong capital D deaf supporting ASL user all the way, voice off, all of these things, right? And that was kind of my professional identity in the beginning of my field. And I felt very confident and very strong in that. And I was very resistant to other perspectives in educating deaf children. It all started to change though in like my second and third years of teaching is when my students started changing and I realized that their needs and their preferences and the things that they wanted to learn and the ways that they wanted to communicate were not always fitting the model that I had in my head. This was quite difficult for me at the beginning too, because in my third and fourth years of teaching, was starting to transition over from moving from a self-contained classroom in a gen ed school to a residential school that had a very strong bilingual model and was trying to strengthen that bilingual, bicultural model from the time that I had arrived. And so I remember one specific story of when I was teaching in a fourth and fifth grade class. And we had just implemented a voice off policy. So basically what that meant for this school is that anyone and everyone that worked at the school, including down to the custodial staff and the office staff, was to make a concerted effort to not use their voice at any time and to only sign so that information was accessible to all students. So in theory, yeah, this sounded great. We had a lot of deaf staff members, a lot of deaf faculty. All of our students used American Sign Language as the language of instruction. And so this worked fine until you get a student that will come up to you and say, well, I want to know how to say this. So my aha moment, or the beginning, my little seed that was planted for me, was when one of my students came up to me and during this voice off policy walked up to me and signed to me, how do you say, and then she fingers spelled the word. And I paused for a minute and I thought, well, she clearly knows that I'm hearing, and she clearly knows that I can say this. She's figured this out thus far. Do I tell her or not? Do I violate this school policy of voice off policy, or do I use this as a moment to teach my student? And so in that split second, I just told her, and then she asked for clarification and practice, and I told her again, and we had maybe a 15-second interaction, and that was the end of it, and she went off, and that was it. And what may have not been a profound moment for her was quite a profound moment for me as a professional, when I realized I can't be so rigid in the way that I approach educating children and communicating with children who are deaf or hard of hearing. I need to learn to be more flexible. I need to understand different perspectives so that I'm serving all students in the capacity that they should be served. And so that was kind of my seed moment. If you really do want to read the specifics of my story, if you look here on slide 10 where it says my journey blog, that story is a little bit detailed out for you, and you're welcome to take a look at that as you like. So the next kind of stage of this is, now that we've reflected, why should we even care, right? How can radically middle thinking inform professional practice and development? And that's really where we want to get to, I think now, especially in these times that we are living in. So real quick, I'd just like to poll some of you folks, if you just want to type in the first word or two that comes to your mind in the chat box. When you hear the word radical, just the word radical, what is the first thing that comes to your mind? All right, I see a trend here. So extreme, different, rebel, a lot of extreme, right? When we hear the word radical, we think this is some sort of extremist type of idea, or this is kind of a rebellious kind of idea. But when we really kind of think about what actually the radical middle is, when we look at it from a political perspective or a philosophical perspective, it really is more of finding that common ground. So the Radical Middle Project came through this whole idea where it is almost kind of extreme in a way to be in the middle of the two polarized ends of our field. So if you think about kind of what camps do you live in, what professional camps do you live in, or what professional silos you find yourself gravitating towards, it almost sometimes seems extreme to say, well, I'm going to come to the middle and find some common ground. And so that's kind of what we're about here at the Radical Middle Project. The radical middle term is actually borrowed from politics. And so when we look at the extremes in our own political discourse, the radical middle are tended to be described as centrists. And so I'll talk a little bit more about what that means and how that applies to being someone that's a part of the radical middle. And so that will be coming here. So when we're thinking about the radical middle and how we develop through these processes, being radical in deaf education is not about being extreme. It's not about being a rebel. It's not about being different. It's about pushing the boundaries of our professional growth that focuses on two really important aspects of developmental stages of professional development, which I classify as renewal and maturity. If you want to learn more about these specific developmental stages, there's a link in the web links for slide 14, developmental stages. But basically, when we're going through the professional development process, or when we're going through professional growth, we go through these 4 stages, and they are also quite cyclical. First, we're kind of in survival mode. So if we go back to my story of when I was a 4th, 5th grade teacher, and my student came up to me and just asked me out of the blue, how do I say this? My first kind of reaction was, I need to get through this interaction without having anything happen. So I was in survival mode. As you go through these modes, then you realize you start to see things in different ways, and you start to grow in different ways. And so each thing is going to basically depend on where you are and how you're dealing with specific situations. If we look at, then we move into the consolidation model. That's kind of when you're thinking about how can I move past being in surviving the actual moment or the crisis, and then trying to master strategies on how to deal with it. So you're kind of saying, okay, I know that I need to deal with this, but now I need to find ways that I can approach this. Should this happen again, or should I have this situation in another environment? Once we kind of develop our toolkit of tasks on how we can deal with these things, we move into this stage of renewal. So for example, you might start to look elsewhere for more information out in the field. You might start beginning to make those connections. So when we become part of the radical middle, we have moved past that kind of survival and consolidation stage, and we're looking now to find new and innovative ways to approaching certain things that come up in the field. So that renewal is about finding the people, finding the information, going to those conferences, going to those places so that you can prioritize listening and learning to others that have other perspectives. And once we start doing that, then we kind of ease ourselves into the stage of maturity where we can all see our shared goal of success, which every person I've ever met in deaf education ever, regardless of philosophy, has always kind of agreed with me on the shared goal is we just want deaf and hard of hearing children to be successful. And so at that stage, at the maturity stage, is when we're really making beautiful professional connections with others and collaborating cross philosophical beliefs and cross disciplinary expertise. So based on the need for, and I'm going to go back real quick, based on the need for this renewal and maturity in the field of deaf education, the Radical Middle Project was kind of born out of, it started with 5 and then ended up being 10 founding members who were all doctoral students that realized that we needed to have a way to have connection and collaboration across philosophy. And so through that development, we decided that we needed to have a mission and goal for our efforts. And so we currently focus on creating a community of practice. And that community of practice is not just limited to folks in academia, while that kind of started that way. Because what we've begun to realize over the years is that when folks in academia, professors and researchers and all of these folks, even if they're making strong connections, sometimes that does not filter down to others that need to have that connection or that information or that access. So we made a commitment as a group to create a community of practice that doesn't only include researchers, but includes teachers, parents, I should even put on there interpreters as well, and members of the deaf community, deaf people themselves, around the goal of philosophical partnership. And so this has been kind of a challenge, but also kind of enlightening as well. The radical middle is about building bridges between all of these groups. Parents often feel intimidated by going to professionals or members of the deaf community to get information or to get advice on what they should be doing with their deaf and hard of hearing child. And so one of the things that we do at the Radical Middle is to find ways where anyone can feel comfortable with seeking the advice of others in a safe space, where people know that others are watching and others are keeping folks accountable for using, good choices in the way they explain things, that they're not being too far on one side of the pole or the other, and that people are making positive and valuable bridges with one another. Part of that too is taking that, having that commitment to recognize different vantage points. So going back to, if I go real quick, back to this image, is understanding that a lot of us kind of live in this world here in deaf education, where it doesn't matter what the right answer is. It just really depends on where where your vantage point is. There we go. I went a little crazy there. There we go. Also, too, part of the things that we work on in the radical middle is working on being better as people and as professionals and not just being right. And finally, really challenging ourselves to move out of those boundaries of our philosophical silos. I went to a conference, and I know that there's likely some Florida folks on here too. I went to a conference that RMTC hosted last fall, and the keynote speaker, Stacy Tucci, talked a lot about that children who are deaf or hard of hearing need something called a continuous cycle of care. And so part of what this is here, too, when we look back at this slide, that connection between researchers, teachers, parents, deaf individuals, this continues on, interpreters, speech language pathologists, early interventionists, all of these folks, that continuous cycle of care or connection is what's really needed in our field to make sure that we are all working together to meet the needs of our students as well. And so that's another thing that the radical middle is about. Oftentimes people say, well, if I'm radical middle, then that means I'm neutral. So if I am a person that is an advocate for bilingual, bicultural education, and I am having conversations with folks that are advocates of listening and spoken language, does that mean that I'm being neutral, or are you being neutral to the issues that surround both of those ideals? And no, it's not about being neutral. One of the things that we really try to advocate for our members is that you need to be really strong and confident in your own philosophical approach. And it's about opening your eyes and listening and trying to see things from other perspectives, not necessarily to change what your beliefs are. So it's not about trying to win the communication wars. I know that's something that's been going on forever. And I don't think we'll ever win the communication wars because, one, it shouldn't even be a war. It should just be done with. But there's no winning because there's really no one right way. And sometimes that's hard for people to wrap their minds around. But when we take a look at the heterogeneous nature of our field and the different perspectives and preferences of not only deaf individuals, but their families as well, we know that there is no one right way to approach these sorts of things. So knowing that, how can we collaborate and connect with these professionals and stakeholders representing these different perspectives? Well, first, we need to start with changing the narrative. There's a wonderful series of TED Talks and now a book written by Celeste Headley, and I have a quote down here from her. I did not try to change his mind, I just listened to him. And a lot of her talks are around how we have difficult conversations with folks that we may or may not be seeing eye to eye with. And so she has a lot of really wonderful strategies. And so part of changing the narrative in any kind of difficult conversation is to find strategies that you really have to think about to make connections with folks, to really, really listen to them and to understand their point of view. One of the things that we've implemented this year on our Facebook group page, and you can see we have two Facebooks here. One is the group and one is the page. The group is a private area that you have to be a member of, and anyone can be to have these discussions. But we've kind of instituted these professional developments where we're going through these various tips on how to have better conversations with people that have very, very different viewpoints than you. And one of the first ones we featured was assuming positive intent. And so when we think about that common thread that exists amongst all the parents and professionals and researchers and deaf community members, that common thread that we all have is that all deaf children are successful. And so when we approach people in our field and we say, well, I'm going to assume positive intent that you also believe that we want success for deaf people, that is the first step in really beginning some of those opening conversations with folks with different viewpoints. And so those are some of the things that we talk about. Also, part of challenging and changing the narrative is to opt in to be radical. I'm borrowing this from Hands and Voices, who they do a monthly call on child abuse and neglect and safety for deaf and hard of hearing children. And one of the things they end every call with that I think is really beautiful is they say, well, yesterday I did fill in the blank. Today I did fill in the blank. And tomorrow I will fill in the blank. And so when you're opting in to being a radically middle professional, you really have to think about, all right, what have I done in the past? Okay, and how can I change that? Today, what will I make a commitment to? And then from this point on, what will I do to make a commitment to changing my practice as a professional in deaf education? So I thought this was kind of just a really nice way to frame how we can begin to think about how we can change ourselves as professionals in the field. Some things to also consider when we're creating what we call a courageous space, or when we are taking the initiative to talk in what could be potentially harsh environment, is that we have to take these things into consideration. So coming in with a positive, assuming positive intent, respecting, listening to understand, taking responsibility, and then this whole idea of making space and taking space. And that's kind of where I got this image from. So we see this little plant trying to grow in the middle of the road. And instead of kind of just crushing the plant, saying, well, this is where the line needs to be, the person painting the line carefully went around to create space for that plant. And that's kind of the image or the idea of what we need to be doing with our own professional interactions with parents and students and our colleagues. I saw a hand go up. The changes are small. Yes. Okay, so Catherine had mentioned before when I looked at these I will statements here, I'm going to assume that the changes for yesterday, today, and tomorrow are small changes and not huge leap to change. Yes, absolutely. This is a very slow and careful process. So no one expects anyone to just kind of jump into being radical middle overnight. Everybody is kind of in a different place, and big change is scary. You're absolutely right. And so these changes or these commitments that we make from a day-to-day basis are little things that we can do. So today I'm going to sit down with the SLP to really understand what she's doing with my students. Or, today I'm going to read an article from a publication that typically publishes things that are different from my philosophical views, those types of things. We just want to make little small changes. One of the things too is to just really talk to people, making that human connection and seeing folks that have different views from you and seeing them as a human being or as a person can make a vast difference on your interactions with them. And that's really why and how the radical middle even came to be, is that when there was about 6 of us at the time, 6 doctoral students with very different views in deaf education and very different approaches. We sat down over coffee and we just started to talk. And once we kind of connected on a human level, then we built trust. And once we built trust, then we could freely, openly talk about some of the things that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. And we really began to understand each other. And so part of that too is trust. And then if we look at this courageous space list, that confidentiality. And so that's why we've established the group the way that we have. It's a private group, so it's not a public forum. Nothing leaves that group. And so we maintain this confidentiality so that we can create a space of trust amongst one another, and we can freely talk, knowing that we're all here for a reason and no one is there really to try to tear anyone down, or I think Catherine is typing, or to tear anyone down, or to try to call them out as being wrong. Thanks, Catherine. I do too, and I think trust is a big part of it as well. And that's one of the talking points that we'll be focusing on in some of our future professional development sessions on the radical middle group. So when we're looking at those first steps, or when we're starting to take those baby steps, those yesterday I did and today I will and tomorrow I will statements, here are some things that you can look forward to or start doing in your own practice. So the first could be to open an honest and judgment-free dialogue with someone who's your professional or philosophical counterpart. Making an honest attempt to recognize that you come to the field with a personal bias, and those biases may impact the way you interact with your parents or your students or other professionals. One thing that we work on quite frequently on the group is to avoid making definitive statements. It's so difficult for us as academics and researchers and professionals to not make definitive statements because many of them are grounded in research. But the more and more I read, especially the more and more I read outside my own area of expertise, for every definitive statement I find under one philosophy, I find another that contradicts it in another. And so what that tells me is, no, we're not wrong. It's just that we have a lot more variation than we tend to be willing to accept. So remembering that there is room for more than one truth is kind of something that a narrative that I keep in my mind. That we have to take a step to view the field from different perspectives and experiences without compromising our own knowledge base or belief system. So it's not about giving up on what you believe. It's not about being neutral. It's just viewing the field on a more broader perspective. And then, of course, making a pact, because we do this for the students, not for ourselves. And so in the end goal, it's all about the kids. These are some of the rules of engagement that we use on our online community practice. So we find that these conversations are often better in person, but it's difficult to make connections with people in person when we span a wide geographical region. And so when we do our online conversations, these are some of the questions that we use to kind of help keep people in track. Because sometimes it's hard to read people through text, and sometimes what we write is misinterpreted. So being careful on how we choose our words when we're having conversations, especially in online settings too, is something else that is an important part of focusing on the middle. This last little part here is something that I picked up off a blog. So this How to Be Wrong is also linked on the web links under slide 24. And sometimes when you feel like you are just not getting through to another person when you are talking to them, or you don't feel like your perspective is being understood, these are some strategies that we found that our members have found to be beneficial when having these dialogues, both online and in person. So first is to, if you're not getting anywhere in the conversation, to pause and take a deep breath, and then to reflect. Are you really as sure as you seem about what you're saying? Is there a possibility that there could be another truth or another perspective that is also correct? In order to have a productive dialogue too, to understand the other person, is you have to know what you want to get out of it. Are you there to try to convince someone that you're right, or are you there to really try to understand a different perspective and grow? And growing, we know, is very uncomfortable. And when you're wrong, be okay with it. Say, you know what, I'm wrong about that, and be willing to admit it and be willing to apologize. And I think when we especially practice some of those later things on the list, or the things lower down on the list, we really start building a lot more trust and respect with one another too, that we can realize that not everyone is 100% right every single time. And then to kind of send us all off in terms of this whole idea, I love this quote. I fight, but not your neighbor. Fight rather all the things that cause you and your neighbor to fight. And when I read this, I really think it embodies a lot of the issues that we see in deaf education. And so I always try to keep this in the front of my mind when I'm doing my work and when I'm reading and when I'm interacting with my professional colleagues, because really when it comes down to it, we are all in this together, and we are such a small field that it does not make sense for us to be divided even further. We are stronger together. And so that's where I'll leave you. And we do have some time for questions. This is also linked out in the web links page. Please, if this is something that is of interest of you, or if you would like to be part of the dialogue, join our Facebook group. That's where we have all of our hot discussions. We also have a page, so if you're just interested in kind of keeping up to date of what we're doing in conferences and the like, you don't have to be part of the group if that's not something you're not ready for, and you can just like us on Facebook. We also have a Pinterest that we're starting on our Art of Expertise series, and that started with the assuming positive intent and other tips for having productive discussion. And then we're also on Twitter as well. So at this point, we're wide open for questions. So Harold asks, what barriers have you faced in this effort? Oh my. More so as we've been moving forward, less and less. But I will say in the beginning of this whole idea, I would often pitch this idea to folks and say, hey, we're starting a little group of professionals, that we're trying to have some philosophical unification. And people would say, this is never going to work. Or they tell me, oh, well, we don't need to do that. We don't have any problems in our field. Or what are you talking about? These language wars. We've solved this problem long ago. And so we find that people sometimes don't even realize that these things exist. However, in my interactions, especially with teachers and parents, I think they feel it the most. And so, people may say what we're doing, or people feel like, I even had one member tell me, am I being catfished into believing something that I don't want to believe, because they felt that there was maybe more of a voice in one philosophical perspective over another at that given time. People don't sometimes believe that there are people out there that really do want to make these connections and find ways to unify the field. So those are probably the largest barriers that I faced most recently, or just disbelief that we even need this type of work in the field. Is the Radical Middle Group nationwide or Florida-based? This is actually international. We have participants from all over the world. There are, let me look real quick. There's just under 1,050 members right now. And so we span pretty much mostly in the United States and Canada, and we do have some international members as well. And we've also presented nationally. And then how will you know if the group's core goals are being met? Yeah, so we have 9 group administrators who also serve as the Radical Middle Board. And we have very strictly moderated content. So we put up content, and if it's something that we know needs to have discussion, we put time frames around that content so that we know that there are moderators available to make sure that people are following the mission of the group. Also, too, if members want to post content or questions or resources, all of that has to get approved through a board of 9. So everything is very carefully monitored and filtered. I will not say that it's perfect. Just last summer, we had a very hot discussion on the Gears article that came out with regards to using sign language with students that also have cochlear implants. And so, sometimes it can get pretty intense, but at the same time, having a group of people there that are all there to make sure that we are staying within the parameters of being respectful, that helps a lot. And we were able to diffuse a lot of some of, what could have been a very inflammatory conversation. We were able to diffuse a lot of it. So we try to structure things as much as possible. But again, it's not a 100% perfect strategy. How do I define success? Oh, good gosh, I don't know. I think I don't know if we're successful yet. I think I'll define success when I'm at a point where I feel like the majority of our field really is working together. I think when we see researchers doing research together and sharing information together, and when we see schools and teachers and administrators and everyone doing what I say, I call it all the things. Do all the things, or at least make all the things available or all the options available. I think when we get to that point, then maybe I'll define it as success. I'm not sure. Right now, I'm taking it as baby steps, and we've come a long way in the last couple of years. So, the six of us are now 1,047. So I guess that is, a small jump of success. And so I think time will tell. And then how to become an involved member. Thanks, Catherine. So to be involved, if you really want to be a part of the discussion, I would suggest to join the Facebook group. That's where the majority of our conversations occur. And so if you can find us on Facebook, it's Facebook.com/groups/ the radical middle DHH. There's also a link in the web links area. You can be a member or participating member by joining the group. We're also doing a lot of presentations and professional development. So some of my other colleagues that are board members have been doing professional developments for teachers, and we're starting to broaden our capacity in presenting at workshops and at conferences. And oftentimes folks will come to that as well to have that face-to-face opportunity as well. I tried the Facebook. It comes as not found. Ha! Thank you. It may have been a copy paste error, but Sherry has posted the correct link in the chat box. And you can search and find it quite easily. Thank you, Sherry, for posting those links as well. Does anyone else have any comments or questions about what we do, or comments about how you are dealing with some of these issues? Thanks, Harold. I don't think we will. We are a small, what do we call ourselves? A 9-woman show, but we really have 2 gentlemen now on the board. So we are let me do my math, 7-woman, 2 gentlemen show. We are not funded, by the way. This is all volunteer work that we do. This is our service to the field. And every year we see a little bit more growth. And so I don't think we will. I do think it's important, and I think that the only way that we're really going to progress and be successful as a field is when we combine our efforts and really learn to respect and appreciate what each side of the field has to offer one another. So I appreciate that comment. Thank you.
All right, if there are any more questions or comments, feel free to continue to use the chat box down below. We want to take this time to thank Dr. Majorana Basas for being here today and sharing information on the radical middle. And ladies and gentlemen of the audience, we thank you so much for allowing us to be a part of your day today. We love hearing from you, and all of us at the Resource Materials and Technology Center for the Deaf, Hard of Hearing are happy to help in any way that we can. You can connect with us through social media like Facebook, Twitter, and Pinterest. You can also sign up for our newsletter. We would love your comments on social media about what you learned today at hashtag RMTC-DHH and hashtag RMTC-DHH live. We did do a quick little live Twitter feed today, so you can go and check that out with some of the slides from today's presentation. As you know, RMTC-DHH is a B's discretionary project, and all of the services that we provide are free. One way that we can continue to do that is by collecting survey data to justify why our services are needed. If each of you would please complete the survey right now, we would greatly appreciate it. You can go to the link posted in the presentation pod. You can scan the QR code. If you had a colleague who missed this broadcast or you would like to rewatch it, head on over to http://rmtc-dhh.org/TA-live for the recorded version of this presentation. Once again, we'd like to thank Dr. Majorana Basas for being here and for all of you for sharing your afternoon with us. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, feel free to put them in the chat box. We see that some people are typing, so we're going to hang out for just a few more minutes. In the meantime, we would like to take a moment to thank our CART personnel for being here today. Thank you so much, Sheila, for coming in and captioning for us and making this accessible for everyone.